So our esteemed speakers and our two panelists. Well, this morning we start this very inspiring conference with three very good keynote speeches, including, of course, Carrie. I think she should be one of our honorary members, and she really has great heart in our city. And likewise, our two speakers, so Terry and Rocco, one can see how they have contributed and have the great heart for better city, better urban design in the respective cities. Maybe in this moment, I won't take any more time, but pass the mic to our first panelist, Lawrence, and to respond to the three earlier keynote speakers. Lawrence, please.
Thank you, Bernard. Just like to say a couple of things in response to Sir Terry and Rocco's comments. I think Terry's Faro review, I think, is a really great example of public engagement beyond consultation, and he's shown us his urban rooms, what his urban rooms have done in the UK. But I think he didn't mention the word champions today, which is all over your website. I think champions not as heroes, but champions in terms of places and instigators is very, very important for us to try and achieve here in Hong Kong as well. And Rocco, I'm so happy to hear you remind me of your 2008 Good, Bad, and Sustainable. I remember our conversations in 2007 when I did a publication, a 10-year review of Hong Kong, and we talked about Hong Kong's competitiveness. So aside from those two comments, I'd like to maybe contribute to the discussion a bit by throwing out a few questions and a few opportunities for Hong Kong. Firstly, I think urban design is not just about hardware, it's not just about hard spaces, but also about software. And I'd really like to see Hong Kong invest more in its soft infrastructure beyond smart systems. And by that I mean things like sustainable technology and education, which Terry's already doing in the UK. Also, our demographics are changing. Everyone knows a third of Hong Kong is going to be senior citizens in the next 15 years. So with changing demographics, with changing industrial structure, and changing affordability, which has been very, very pronounced in the past 10 years, what are we doing about that? Not in the next 10 years, but in the next maybe 15 years going forward to 2030. Also, the issue of quality of the built environment. I think, generally speaking, we can't just look at quality as a given, but we have to look at quality in terms of design at different scales and design for different people, because our demographic mix and our population is drastically changing. And then lastly, on the theme of the conference, betterment of the city, I looked up various definitions of betterment of the city. It deals with investing in things that can improve our city. I'd like to ask really what's at stake? If we don't improve in the next, let's say, 10 to 30 years, what is at stake? Is Hong Kong going to still be Asia's world city? Or, I'm going to really throw out a bomb here, is Hong Kong going to mutate into, for better or worse, China's world city? That's a rhetorical question, I think is worth considering, but certainly in terms of city competitiveness, and you can look across all the global indexes of city competitiveness, I think 10 years ago we were somewhere like 4 or 5 in terms of city competitiveness. Now I think we're about 6, 7, or 8, and there are various reasons for that. So what are the opportunities? What can we do about that? What can we invest in? Design is one thing, participation is another thing, governance is another thing. Firstly, I think, as I mentioned, soft infrastructure is very important. Things like health, technology, and education. Connectivity to the PRD, I think, is essential to our survival. It's one of the great advantages we have as Asia or China's world city. Our TOD model is the best in the world, I would argue, and I think that could lead the way, not only for China, but for many, many other Asian cities. Urban regeneration that includes heritage, that is able to upgrade a lot of our building stock and a lot of our streets is a great opportunity for Hong Kong. And I think finally, for me, the great hope, and this is with the hopefully with the willpower of the government, is our forthcoming harbourfront authority. We've got over 100 kilometers of waterfront. I think that will redefine Hong Kong in the next 30 years, so we can get our act together. And that includes West Kowloon, Kai Tak, Central, Wan Chai, North Point, the list goes on and on. If we can get that right, we can get our PPP models right without too much protest. I think that is a really amazing opportunity for Hong Kong to redefine itself and really live up to our reputation as Asia's world city. And one only has to look at our neighbors. You know, what have our neighbors done over the past 10 years? Without being too critical, I'm just going to list the cities beginning with S. Shenzhen. What's happened to Shenzhen in the past 10 years? Shanghai, Seoul, Sydney, Singapore. Right? Look at what's happened in these past 10 cities in terms of growth, innovation, quality, livability, and sustainable. I would argue that they've all taken actions and gone very, very far in terms of bettering themselves. And I would hope Hong Kong in the coming, not 10 years, but in the coming 20 years, can do a lot of, let's say, catching up and really go to the next level.
Thank you, Lawrence. So I think Lawrence raised some very good questions for us to think about further. So may I pass the mic to Zon at the moment, and then we'll come further discussion. May I ask the organizer, do we have mic for the floor in a moment? So I would probably like the panelists and our speakers raise these important questions, and later think about what you have to contribute to. Okay, Zon, please. Yeah.
Okay, well, a lot of ground was covered there, so I'll try and address some of the other issues. I think in relation to the Farrell review, we need to design for change. Change will inevitably happen, and so it's a question of how we can manage change within the city, retaining its existing features and characters and taking it into a new age. One of the key concerns is inclusivity in the process of identifying appropriate and widely supported courses of action in managing change. But there is also a need for strong leadership in identifying and driving forward a grand plan or a vision of the city at many levels, not at the strategic city planning level, to transformative district projects, and to local community-orientated projects. So it's this kind of dilemma between including everybody, but also having somebody who facilitates the development of proposals through the systems over time. I was reminded in looking at the Farrell review, and in looking particularly at the level of inclusiveness at both the professional level within the review system, and also the intention to bring education into that same forum. I was reminded of Jane Jacobs saying that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And I think it's really essential that any urban design plan for the city kind of embraces those things at many levels. Another view is that from a less renowned commentator, I guess, Will Self, is that the fundamental apprehension is that the city is an organism of some form rather than being governed from above. And there is some concern that I know that Terry has been talking about the development of the city as a kind of an evolving organism, biological organism, some things which we can influence and some things which find their own way, and some aspects of that which we grow to love and form part of our environment. So it's really looking at how we can drive those through. There's a question of the who would champion these groups that Terry's been talking about would be championing contributions into ideas for the public realm. And I think there has been discussion about the mayoral aspects of development in London and in New York, which has really promoted transformative projects within the urban realm. And we have a few of those in Hong Kong. I too am not so pessimistic. I think Rocco's identified a number of things that actually have transformed the city. When we were doing the Central Wan Chai reclamation, we were looking at the character of the existing areas and how they could extend themselves both physically and thematically into the urban waterfronts along the Hong Kong island. Some of those have happened. Others have been more difficult to develop, but it has resulted in things like the extension of bridge networks and retail bridge networks through IFC to the waterfront. We need more of that. We need more of these spaces and urban spaces and open spaces integrated with circulation routes through the city. And increasingly, we need to give back a lot of the streets to pedestrians. It comes to mind in looking at Rocco's presentation that things like Nathan Road, one of the greatest arteries through the Kowloon Peninsula, used to be a pedestrian street of renown that connected through to the waterfront. Now we have to circumnavigate several city blocks and go into a subway and through shopping malls to make those connections. And I think it's a question of the balance of transportation needs and the needs of the public in terms of a livable city needs to be rebalanced. And in that respect, I think the comments on the Marylebone High Roads calculations of pedestrian movement against vehicle movement is quite interesting in that respect. We have looked at pedestrianisation of various streets, and I guess our high line is an old model, which is the escalator up through Central up to the mid-levels. And originally that started off as a transportation project, it was a means of getting people up to mid-levels in rush hours and so forth, and taking traffic off the roadways. But actually what it is a massive regeneration project, which has really resulted in the transformation of those areas. And increasingly that's happened now in Saingpun with the connections to the MTR, our systems. But what's happening in Saingpun is actually that's also resulting in the loss of the very things that actually made the Saingpun area characterful and meaningful. And so we need to be mindful of change in that respect as well.
Thanks very much, Sean. So in fact, Sean and Lawrence points out the questions. How would our city move? How would it go? How to maintain our city competitiveness? Now, before I pass this question back to Sir Terry and Rocco, anyone on the floor would like to comment or raise anything to our two speakers here? Anyone? Yes, please.
Yes, I was struck in Terry Farrell's talk about, there was one slide where you pointed out that...
Would you please stand up so that we can...
There was one slide where Sir Terry Farrell pointed out that taller buildings could be at the same density as the shorter buildings, and you were suggesting that the shorter buildings were more effective in an urban sense. I heard the opposite message coming from Rocco's presentation, who is designing very beautiful but much taller buildings than could be designed at the same density if they were much shorter. I just wondered if you could both comment on that apparent contradiction.
Interesting observation. Do they contradict, Sir Terry? Yes.
Well, I think that the densities that are in Hong Kong are much greater than that particular site in London. I was merely demonstrating that the same amount of floor area could achieve other urban qualities if it was spread out and lower, more commensurate with the surrounding area. But I absolutely accept that in Hong Kong there is much greater density, and the high-rise has a place, has a role in achieving that kind of urbanism. I don't think it's contradictory. I think they're very different places and very different densities.
Yes, thank you, Sir Terry. Rocco, what's your observation?
I think you actually raised a very good point. Now, first of all, I believe that in the center of the city, the CBD, the density in basically is so high that inevitably you have to go to a high-rise development. However, in certain areas, a mid-rise could actually be a very good solution. The problem is in Hong Kong, the building law does not really permit a mid-rise in the same sort of typology as we have in London, I think. I mentioned you can either have a tower on a podium, because beyond a certain height, the certain limit of the site coverage dictates that you are limited in the form and type of the building that you could erect. The problem at the moment is that beyond or below 15 meters, you could cover up 100% of the site. And that is the problem, that if you don't want to go high, you have to force yourself to cover really fully the site up to 15 meters. And that is detrimental in many ways to the urban environment. So the peculiarity of building laws in both cities contributes to this apparent contradiction, I think, that you raise.
I think it's very nice. Our speaker raised the issue, how in fact our cities, our building form, our design, now the laws are constraining to a certain very major extent. So what do you think about that? So any other comments from other colleagues? Yes, someone at the end of the room. It's good someone raised something at the end of the room, because often those sitting at the end of the room tends not to be that engaging, but it's so nice. So thank you.
I'm very impressed by Rocco's speech about the Hong Kong law, and then generally he's saying that the law limits the creativity of urban planners and architects, but we all know that the law will not be changed even after we criticize it. Tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, the law will be not changed. So what is the solution? What I'm just think come out from my head is that is it the problem about the OZP or the plans of Hong Kong's, because in other countries like Melbourne, Australia, or other parts of the world, sometimes they have urban design guidelines. So they have a booklet or a guidelines that control in a very detailed ways what is where the sky garden should be located, or how the building should be step back. So more or less, they almost come with a schematic design, or say a preliminary design of every plot, and then control it, the outline of the building in a very, very detailed manner. So most of the times, as in Hong Kong, when you submit a plan, I want modification, I want exemption, blah, 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 here or there, they will say, if you modify it, it will become a precedent case, and it cannot be applied to other parts of the world. But in Hong Kong, especially the urban planning, nowadays, we are not talking about generic control. We more or less like to have a bespoke kind of a specific control of every part of the region, so that it suits the specific fabric. Is it to revamp or to make a urban menu or guidelines for a particular district is the solution?
Okay,
or way
so
out?
thanks you. So I pass this question first to Sir Terry and Rocco, or maybe Son and Lawrence to jump in if you want to. Sir Terry, any comments on that? Yes.
I think, first of all, there is a need to really relook at our building law to see what the three-dimensional implication of those laws are. Because when those laws are erected, I don't believe they were erected from a point of view of aesthetics or urban design or sustainability or any of those issues. So we have to really look at our law to see how it could be made or amended to allow more innovation in the architecture. Now, the second point is that I know that in China, certainly, you are allowed to break the law or to suggest to break the law, building law. If you go to a special design review panel where experts And I mean experts, I don't mean government officials. I mean architects and planners and people who are in the know, could objectively hear the arguments and say whether it is a permitted contravention for certain good reasons. I don't think Hong Kong, the government, really could accept that in the existing political climate. And that, I think, is a problem. It used to be, when I practiced 10, 20 years ago, that we could do a lot more things than we could do now. And that is because everybody is so rigid, unwilling to consider, even with very good reasons, a certain contravention of the existing law. So I don't have answers to these questions, but I just point out that these really is the crux of the problem.
Yes. So, anything that we can do as alternative? Any change to our laws or how we view that? And we don't have a design review panel in Hong Kong. I sit on the town planning board for 6 years, but it's not a board that looks at design, but look at mechanism and planning parameters, right? So could there be some change in Hong Kong? So anything from suggestion from Sean or Lawrence too?
I mean, there could be change. I mean, there have been design guidelines and parameters prepared for individual lots, mostly in relation to the reclamation areas where there are large lots, and obviously there is design flexibility possible within the building codes. These were very much geared towards providing an outline strategy for a district and really providing a vision of what this development might be, but more to the point how it might relate to the future infrastructure within the urban area in order to create the kind of point of connectivity with the waterfront and with the urban area that everybody desires to see. That hasn't been applied in the same way in the urban area, and it is only comes up when it goes to Section 16, and that's a different animal. There are projects that have gone out to design build contracts, for example, now come with a more specific brief. It's a mishmash of information quite often, some quite restrictive aspect, a demonstration scheme essentially with building massing, and down to how many benches you need to provide. And so it's very uneven, I think, and it could be.
Thank you.
Developed.
Lawrence?
Yeah, definitely. I think we can. I think, again, we could start with the Harbourfront Authority. And again, we could look at our neighbors. Shenzhen and Qianhai has a design review panel for everything on the waterfront. Seoul Metropolitan Government has a design review panel for every single project that touches the water or is facing the water. And Shanghai, the Liang'an, the two waterfront authority committee has reviews not only on heritage, but also on design merit. So these are all governmental regulations that look at design merits in 3D and in terms of quality, whilst taking into account ecology and heritage. So I think we should start with the Harbourfront Authority.
Thank you, Lawrence. Any more comments or last question that you want to raise to our panel? Yes, please. Please. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the speakers and panelists. A question about our density. Both speakers have talked about increasing the GFA and increasing the density. In views of urban designers, do you think cities should set a limit to the density? Or, for example, for buildings, there are number of people who use the building. We set a limit to it. We have fire regulations. We have all these amenities. In cities, we have open space infrastructures and buildings. So on top of 4 floor area GFA, shall we set a limit, or should city has a limit to the density?
Okay, thank you. So Terry, you have any recommendations from you?
My view is that there should be much greater literacy about what densities mean, rather than have a conversation about whether it should be higher or lower. I think density literacy, like urban design literacy across many fronts, is about choices, and it's about at a higher density, higher densities, you get a much greater amount of communal benefit. You keep free open space. Hong Kong is very high density, but that's because you have the mountains and the sea. So you actually are paying for density with other benefits. And the density does give you a great deal of community advantages. I don't know what the upper limits of density are. I think it's up to designers to explore that. Very, very high buildings or one very high building could produce a very different result to low buildings. But I think most importantly, it's about density literacy, because at the end of the day, it's not about what it looks like alone. It's only one component. It's what happens at ground level. What animation at ground level? What degree of sunlight penetration? What degree of access to open space? What benefits does density give you in terms of transport? I think these are all questions that have to be put in the mix before you actually say this density is good or that density is bad. And I think it's about educating. It's about returning to the earlier point, the last question. I think that rules have to be challenged, but they have to be challenged not just by experts and design panels. I think they've got to be challenged because by the general population. I strongly believe you begin with school children and you look longer term, because whoever is 10 years old today in 2030 is going to be 25 and an adult making comments and using the urban environment. So I think it's about literacy, the issue of density.
Thank you, Sir Terry. Rocco, last comment from you.
I think there are certain objective criteria to assess density, like Terry said, adequate ventilation, lighting, the capacity of the pavement to take people, congestion, that sort of thing. But ultimately, density is both a subjective thing and a cultural thing, I think. How much density is optimum depends on the society, depends on our cultural background. It also depends on the time. Somebody from the Middle Ages, if you bring them to Hong Kong, they would go berserk. Now, in 100 years' time, maybe we could welcome even greater density. I don't know. It's a subjective thing. But I think that it's inevitable that we are moving towards even greater density. It's simply a matter of resources, that land resources is getting scarcer and scarcer all over the world. And therefore, any means to make greater density a workable solution should be explored. But what is optimum density? I think it's something for the whole community to debate, to assess, and to come to a consensus. Different people have different perception of density. When I was in Berlin, I thought the city is almost deserted every day. Buildings are so far apart and there's so little people on the street. But they may be perfectly happy. And back in Hong Kong, a tourist might tolerate for a week. They wouldn't tolerate for years. But we are okay. So I don't think there's a universal or standard for density. And it changes with time. And it changes also with the solution that we could devise in creating greater density.
Thank you, Rocco. So very interesting, inspiring discussions. Well, Rocco, you have presented something like a 10-year review of the scene in urban design and architecture. Well, in the movie side, we have this subtly 10-year. But anyway, I hope for architecture and urban design and for our planning, we have a positive 10 years ahead with all this discussion and contribution. Thanks very much, all of you. Thank you.